Hello everybody and welcome back to part 3. So we've created our player character, we can move around, we can shoot projectiles. The next thing we're going to look at doing is creating an enemy object, and then we're going to place some instances of that object around the room, and we're going to create these little green blob enemies that will chase after our player character. We'll be able to shoot them down, and when they touch the player we'll be able to restart the game. So we'll have all the fundamental mechanical blocks, as it were, of our prototype game. The first thing we're going to do though, before we do any of that, is we're actually going to speed the game up a little bit. At the moment, by default, the GameMaker project is set to 30 frames a second game speed. We're going to change that up to 60. This is something you should generally always do very, very early on, because it can affect a ton of things in your game. The longer you leave it before you change it, the harder it'll be to then adjust all of your movement timings and so on, assuming you've locked them to your frame rate. So let's go now and go to options in the resource tree, okay? Unfold that if you haven't already. The global game settings for your game are now listed in the resource tree for each individual platform as well. You can open them up there. We want to just open up the main global game settings for our game, so just double click on main there and you'll see it brings up game options window. Now, just at the very top here, just on main options general, you can see game frames per second. We're just going to change that from 30 to 60. So if you're coming from, and hit apply, if you're coming from GameMaker Studio 1.x, you'll realize that we no longer set room speed per room and use that as your frame rate, okay? You can now set a global game frames per second game speed in your global game settings. Okay, so click OK to that, and now if we run the game again, you'll notice we're now moving 60 frames per second. Nice, slick, and smooth. So let's get started making this enemy object. Okay, so go to sprites first of all, just as we've done previously. Right click, hit create. I'm going to go to import, tutorial resources, images, and find the enemy sprite. Okay, I'm going to click open, click yes, and this is our enemy sprite. Once again, I'm just going to pop the origin point for this dead in the center with middle center. So you should see this little crosshair in the middle there, just identifying the center point of that sprite. We're going to give it a name, SPR_enemy. And that's, oh no, don't want to click over that. Send it back, middle center, leave that in the middle. And that's all we need to do with this guy, so go ahead and close that. The next thing you're going to want to do, just as we always do, is create an object, okay, to define the blueprint for our enemy's behavior. So right click in objects and hit create. Let's call this obj_enemy. Let's set the sprite to be SPR_enemy. Then go ahead and add the create event. Okay, so first of all, let's just make ourselves some space by closing this dock over to the side. Actually, while I'm mentioning that, if I open that back up, if you want to close or rather hide all of the docks at the sides of the screen, you can just click this button up here, collapse expand dock panels, and that'll collapse and re-expand the dock panels. You can also press F12 for the same effect, but you can close them specifically just by clicking this long vertical or horizontal depending bar at the edges of the screen. Okay, let's go ahead and actually just close all of them so we have lots of space here. I'm just going to bring this out here. So an instance of our enemy has just been created, say, in the game. What do we want to actually happen? What do we want to happen when this event goes off? Well, we want to assign a couple of variables, okay? So I'm going to find, just in the common or in the recently used for me, the assign variable action. I'm going to drag that into our drag and drop space. Okay, we're going to assign the variable HP to be 5. That's HP standing for hit points or health. So we're going to give this enemy 5 points of health. Okay, so that doesn't actually mean anything in our game yet. Okay, we've just created the word HP, completely arbitrary, and we said that HP means 5. And what we're going to do throughout this object's logic is say that when that HP is below 0 or is equal or less than 0, to destroy the enemy object. And we'll have it so when it collides with our bullet object, will reduce the HP by 1 every time that happens. Okay, so we've got HP of 5. We're going to assign another variable as well. I'm going to drag in another one of these boxes just underneath, and this one is going to be SP D, okay? That's going to stand for speed. Now be careful here, we're not using the built-in variable speed, okay? So don't type speed or hspeed or any of those. We're making our own variable just called spd. Stands for speed, but that's just for us to know, not GameMaker. What we're going to use this for is just to be a value that we can give to the object to tell it how fast to move towards the player every frame. So I'm just going to set that to something really small. I'm going to use 1.5. Okay, so I'm going to move 1.5 pixels a frame towards the player, which we'll set up in a moment. So let's go to add event now and add the step event. Okay, not the begin or end step, just the regular old step event. Okay, so as we've explained before, step event happens every single frame of the game. So anything we put in here, this object will carry that out every single frame it exists. Okay, so grab the if instance exists action. Okay, it's this little green one in the instances category, and drag that in. So this is just going to check to see if an instance of a particular object exists. So if you just click this, we can get a list of the different objects we've defined. We want to check to see if the player exists. Okay, and if the player exists, we'll move towards the player. If the player doesn't exist, say he's just died or whatever, we could do that later on in the game, then we won't move towards him. We'll only do this if he does exist, because if he doesn't exist and we try and do this, we won't be able to find the player's position. Okay, we'll look for the player's position, we won't be able to find it because he won't exist, and that might cause a bug or a crash. So now, once we've checked to see if the player exists, what we want to do is set our direction to face towards the player. So grab set point direction, we've used this one before, and drag it to the side of this node, okay, so that it joins with a green line like that. We don't want it to join like that, we want it to join this green line, okay, because that means if this happens, do this, okay, whereas if we just put it underneath, it'll just do both regardless. So if the player exists, we want to set our point direction to be for our x coordinate obj_player, and you can see it found that in the autocomplete. And if we type dot, we can refer to a property of the player. Okay, so we can find all sorts of things, all these built-in variables here. Just by typing a dot at the end of object player, we can find various different properties of our player object. What we just want is the x coordinate, okay, so we can click that, or I could have just typed x. I'm just going to type obj_player.y, okay, and that's going to set our direction to point towards wherever the player currently is on the screen. Okay, and that it works to refer to it by the object here because there's only going to be one instance of our player object on the screen at any time. Well, so we would hope anyway. Okay, so now once we've done that, we're going to set our speed. So find the set speed action. Okay, it's just these three arrows. Drag that underneath here. You can drag that one straight underneath as long as it's still connected by this green line, because you can see through this sort of indentation the flow of logic. So if this exists, do this column of stuff. Okay, so set speed, type directional, and our speed can be the variable spd. Okay, we could have just typed 1.5 in there, but it's useful to define that as a variable because then we can use it for other things later. So by typing spd, we're just referring back to the variable that we established in our create event, which is 1.5. And we're just bringing that across into where we set our speed every frame. Okay. The last thing we want to do is just make sure that the image, the sprite for this object faces towards its direction every frame, just as the same as we did with our player object. So just find the set instance rotation action. I can just drag this in down here. We don't want it to be part of this column actually, so just make sure it's not. We're going to set that angle to just be direction. Okay, it's just whatever our direction is, because our direction was set by this node, so we just have to call that direction when setting the angle of rotation for the sprite. Now I should be able to, well, okay, running the game now wouldn't do anything because we haven't actually placed any instances of this enemy in the room. So I'm going to go to our room. So I'm just going to do it from the resource tree, just so you can see where I'm going, even though I had the tab open in my workspace. I can go back and forth just from the tabs to the room editor and the workspace. just like that, but it's easiest just to double click there in the resource tree if you don't know how else to access it. So this is our room 0. I'm just going to drag a few instances of obj_enemy into the room, like so. Okay, then go ahead and run the game. And there they are, and they move towards the player every single frame. We can't actually shoot them or do anything about them yet, but they're there, they're moving, and they work. And you'll have noticed I put all these enemies onto the same layer as our player for now. We should probably create a layer specifically for the enemies at some point, but this should be fine for now. So let's come back to our enemy object. Okay, so let's just double click him. Let's collapse those docks again. And the next thing we're going to want to do is check to see if our HP is less than 0, or rather if it's equal to or less than 0. And if it is, then destroy the enemy object. The reason I say equal to or less than is because we might, if we're going to subtract values from our hit points, we run the risk of going below 0 if we're not careful. And if we're below 0 and we're only checking to see if we're equal to 0, then the object wouldn't get destroyed, when obviously we would probably want our enemies to die if they were on negative health. So it's a nice safety check to sort of apply there. So the first thing I want to do is find if variable. Okay, it's just in the common category. I'm just going to drag this into our node tree. Okay, so if variable, what this does is it asks your game a question, and it says if a particular variable that you've established, so one of these words like SPD and HP, is equal, less, greater, less or equal, or greater or equal to another value, and that value can also be a variable, then do a sequence of things. Okay, so we're going to check to see if HP, let's ignore that, is less or equal to 0. Okay, so if it's less or equal to 0, and then anything we link to this with the green chain is only going to happen if our hit points are less or equal to 0 every single frame. Okay, so all we want to do for that is actually destroy the instance. So I'm going to add this here. So destroy instance, you notice there's no other properties there. Okay, it's just a single node destroy instance. All it does is destroy this particular instance. Okay, and that's all we really need for the enemy step event. Now at the moment, obviously the problem is that our hit points never reach 0 or less than 0 because we established them in the create event as 5, and then nothing actually reduces them. Okay, so we need to make it so our bullets can hit the enemy and actually reduce their HP. So let's bring back our resource tree and go to obj_bullet. Okay, let's open this up. In here, what we want to do is create a new event for collision, and you can see a list of our different objects. I'm going to have a collision with obj_enemy. So this event gets triggered when an instance of obj_bullet collides with an instance of obj_enemy. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to change the hit points of the enemy instance that we've just collided with. Now by default, any node that you put in here applies to the instance running it, so they apply to obj_bullet. So if I go and drag in a sign variable, now I'm going to type HP -1 relative. Okay, so subtract, because I've ticked relative, it's not setting it to -1, it's subtracting -1 from our hit HP variable. But if I were to run this now, this would try to apply itself to a HP variable in the bullet object, and the bullet object doesn't have a HP variable. But what we can do is we can make it so this applies to the enemy instance of what we've collided with instead. If you just click the little down arrow here, it says apply to a different instance if I hover over it. And you can see by default it's set to self. Okay, so by default it will be the bullet applying this node, this action to itself. So instead of that, we want to apply it to not obj_enemy, what you might think, because that would apply it to every instance of enemy in the room. So at the moment we shot one enemy, every enemy would get hit, and we don't want that. We just want to apply it to the one instance that we've hit. We can do that by selecting other. Okay, so click other, and you can see this pink outline shows up around the node to symbolize that it's applying to an instance that's not self. Okay, and if we drag this out here, you can see add -1 to HP on other. Okay, so not on itself, on other. Now other is the other instance involved in a collision event when one occurs. Okay, so when we collide with obj_enemy, the value other becomes the particular instance that we've collided with. So this is how we find the exact enemy we've just hit. Okay, so it's going to find that particular enemy instance and subtract 1 from its HP. Okay, now if we run the game, shoot, you'll notice the enemies can be destroyed, but it's not working exactly how we thought it would. Okay, the bullets are just insta-killing the enemies, or it appears that way. Actually, what's happening is because the bullets themselves are not getting destroyed, they're continuing to collide with the enemy every single frame. So after touching the enemy once, 5 frames later, when they've subtracted 1 hit point every frame, the enemy gets destroyed and then the bullet just carries on. So what we want to do is make sure we destroy the bullet object. So let's drag in a destroy instance into this as well. So let's now run that. We should find, yes, and now we actually have to hit each enemy 5 times for them to go away and the bullets get destroyed as we would expect them to. So the last thing we're going to want to do here is, you might have noticed just then when we were shooting the things, I mean I can run it again, the collision boxes aren't exactly perfect. They're pretty alright for defaults there, but they're not exactly perfect. So what we can do to improve that is if we go to SPR and scope bullet, just bring up the sprite and open collision mask, you can see this big box that's appeared over here. This is the default collision mask, just covers the whole sprite. Okay, if we turn this alpha tolerance bar up, you can see it's automatically calculating a rectangle collision mask, because this is where it'll actually detect a collision, as if this box overlaps the same box of another sprite. Okay. And you can see that by increasing this, we shrink it down from not using all this extra transparent space around, but actually just using the sprite. But here, what we actually want to do is we want to set it manually. So I'm just going to drag this box just by its corners to only overlap the actual tip of the bullet, because this is the part of the bullet that we care about actually hitting the enemy. Okay, this is just sort of a trail behind it, so we don't really care if this touches an enemy. We care about if this bit touches it. Okay, so now if we close that, let's edit all of these. So let's go to our player object, player sprite even, sorry, open the collision mask of that. And let's shrink this down, because we're going to make it so if the player touches an enemy, they also get destroyed, or rather we'll restart the game. So let's shrink that down as well, because we want it to feel fair when the player gets hit. So it's always better when you're doing your collision mask to try and err on the side of making it hard to get hit for the player rather than making it too easy. Because if we stretched it out really big, and say the enemy collided with us in this space here and we got a game over, we'd feel as a player that that would feel kind of unfair. It's like, oh, I wasn't even touching him. And there's always going to be an element of that when you're using a square collision mask. You can use like more precise collision masks, but they are much less efficient. So we're going to stick with the square one. So, but what we're going to do is just shrink it below the size of it, so we actually give the player a bit of leeway so they can actually touch an enemy with the sides of their sprite. It's a very, very common design technique, and actually get away with it. But if they touch way too close, then we kill them, and then that feels a bit more fair. So okay, so let's close the player sprite with that. Let's open the enemy sprite. With the enemy, we can keep it fairly big and generous, because we want the enemies to get hit by the bullet, just as in the same way it will feel, it's like reversed for enemies. So we want the bullets to hit the enemy fairly easily. Like if we made that one really small and our bullets like whizzed past the side of the enemy here without hitting them, we'd be like, oh, that's totally unfair, I totally hit him. You know. So you kind of have to sort of well, you don't have to, but like it's classic design to sort of bias this in the player's favor a little. So that's what we're going to do here. So I'm going to make that about that big, close that. And now let's add some more, before we run the game and actually see what we've done there, let's go to our player object and add an event for a collision with obj_enemy. Okay, and all we're going to do in here is find the game restart action, which is somewhere around here in the game category. Okay, so restart game, this sort of recycle node. You see there's no other options that need to come along with that, just restart game. We collide with any instance of an enemy, and that's good enough. So let's run the game. So as you can see, when the player touches an enemy now, you can see they get quite close before it actually triggers. The game just fully restarts. If I move away and I start shooting at them, you can see they go away. But then if one actually touches me, gets close enough, the game restarts. And you can see our sort of collision masks having an effect on it there as well. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you're continuing to find this useful, and I'll catch you guys on the next part.